Welcome to Underground Strategy Podcast. My name is Max, and I hope that you have been thinking on doctrine and systems thinking last week, because this week we're going to continue our chat with Amos Fox. So let's dive right into it. Enjoy.
I want to, it might be early for this question, but I'm going to throw it out anyway. Thinking about, and I know this is maybe an unfair question, but thinking about future war, you mentioned some important themes, urban warfare, sieges, but can you give us a flavor of some of the things that you think will be there in the future and very prominent?
Yeah, so the future of war. So here's flavors and hang on, I'm writing that down again. Flavors and themes. All right, I'm coming back to that because I'm going to go back to something you had said earlier to answer this question. So one of the things you said earlier was you mentioned the continuity of warfare and how, you know, folks need to be there saying, hey, don't forget, this thing's going to be a continuity. So I was at a conference in Paris at the École Militaire. I said I wouldn't say any German words. I didn't say anything about French, so I'm sure I mispronounced those completely. But in March of 2024, I was at a conference hosted by NATO ACT, which is looking at the future of warfare, right? And so I got up and I gave a presentation very much in line with my book. And, one of the people during the Q&A afterwards, so I got to share the stage. I was one of the four main speakers during the thing. It was me, Peter Roberts, Beatrice Heuser, and then Dima Adamski. So it was cool. I was sitting there on stage with them. During a moment of reflection, as things were getting going, I looked to my left, I looked to my right, and then I looked at myself, and I was like, if I were humble enough to get imposter syndrome, this would be the moment that I get it. But I'm not that humble. And these people are just lucky to be sharing a stage with me. I say that in jest, of course, but nonetheless, after I gave my presentation during the Q&A session, one of the people in the audience is like, he said it in a very negative way. He's like, yeah, continuities are great, but you didn't really say anything about the future. And this conference was on the future of war. I'm like, well, a lot of the continuities are the future. Again, you may not want to hear that.
Yeah.
You may want to hear, no, man, it's sharks with laser beams and, cyber missiles from space coming down and doing something. But by and large, I don't know. Again, it depends on the time frame of future we're talking about. If you're talking next 20 years, I don't think you're going to see significant changes from today to 20 years from now necessarily. You may have some things that are better networked or more networked. More networked may not be better because, everything's a challenge response situation. And you present one thing, and this is the other thing with that. The more you show of yourself and the more you show of your capabilities and the more you show of how you do things, the more you open all that up for other people to figure out how to learn and exploit on their end, right? And so the more, like for the U.S. in particular, the more we're involved in conflicts all over everywhere, the more we're sharing our technology and capabilities with others, the more those others are using those things, the more vulnerable all those things are to being defeated. Now, that's not the period, end of sentence part of that. That whole cycle continues on the other side, right? Then we're learning from what they're learning, and then they're learning from what we're learning, and, on and on and on. But creating technologies and capabilities and things to overcome that cycle of learning is expensive, right? And so at the end of the day, expense is the biggest bookend to making all these cool things that we're talking about a reality, right? And so the cool sharks with laser beams and the cyber missile rockets from space, there may be all those things on the drawing board somewhere at, pick your random defense contractor or defense, industry company. I'm sure they have all that stuff, to varying degrees available in concept, in a working model, whatever the case may be. But the dollar signs are what are prohibitive of all of that. But you know what's cheap? Artillery. Artillery's cheap, and it's easy to get around, and guess what doesn't stop it? Rainy weather, clouds, any of that, right? And so, and really, like, as long as your gun doesn't wear out, and as long as you got folks on the crew to pull the lanyard, right, to pull the string that makes the big gun go pop, That stuff can fire 24/7 as long as you got shells coming in. And the shells, they're cheap, they're easy to produce, they're easy to transport relative to, Gimler's missiles, ATACMS missiles, all these other things. And I don't remember the dollar amount, but, an artillery shell is like $150, $200, right? One of those missiles is $20,000 or $200,000, depending on what type of missile we're talking about here, I think a Hellfire is like 20,000-ish or something. And then if you get out to like ATACMS missiles, you're talking like $500,000, like a mortgage on a decent sized house in mid-America. So those are the biggest prohibitors for a lot of this technological advancement. And that's on the U.S. side, and we're supposed to be, and I say this a bit tongue-in-cheek, but we're supposed to be the wealthiest, state out there from an economic standpoint by and large. When you look around the world, not a lot of other people have the money that we do, nor devote as much of their money to defense as we do, right? So if we can't do it, who else is going to be able to do it? China, perhaps, because their system is just completely different, right? Their priorities as a country are vastly different than the U.S. and many Western states. So maybe they're out there already producing these things, and we might know about that. We might not, But by and large, like if the U.S. isn't leading that, and again, as we talked about earlier, like if it's not coming into NATO through the U.S., it's probably not coming in anytime soon. So there's that. I think that's like one of the biggest governors on any kind of like crazy futuristic change in the character and or nature of war, right? And so there's going to be continuities. And again, the other thing to consider also is, and this is a point that Tony King makes really well, and I borrow it from him every time I talk about this, is cities are getting bigger, right? So big cities are getting bigger and expanding into suburbs. Suburbs are getting bigger and expanding into big cities. Road networks are clogging all that together, right? And so you just have these massive urban sprawls. Armies are getting smaller because we're having to buy more multi-domain task forces to bring MDO to life, right? And all these cool, expensive, exquisite munitions. So the U.S. Army this past year, they cut, I forget the number now, but it was like 16 cavalry squadrons, a bunch of engineer battalions, military police battalions, all sorts of stuff to make room to grow MDTFs, right? Because we're all basically in the zero-sum game in terms of, force structure in our militaries. Very few states are out there saying, you know what, we're going to pay more money to get a bigger army. A lot of us are like, well, this is the budget, and I'm going to cut these formations to make these formations a reality. And so that also is contributing to, the shrinking of land forces. And so as land forces get smaller and cities get bigger, but then going back to systems thinking and systems theory, adversaries are like, first, I'm not going to die. And then second, if I'm not going to die, I'm going to try and win. And if I fight them out in the open and they're trying to hit me with all these missiles from really far away, that's stupid. I'm going to go into this city, right? That there is a continuity, right? So urban warfare is going to be a thing. If your small army goes into a city, you may find yourself surrounded, or you may actually be able to surround, if you have some sort of coalition or an alliance of some sort, you may be able to surround a city. So sieges are then a continuity of war, right? And then when you factor all those things together, the attritional character of war that is bled across, the history of war from the beginning of war to today is going to continue to be a continuity of war, because block by block fighting, however you approach it, whether it's killer robots or infantrymen and armor, moving in unison through a city, or just leveling buildings with long-range artillery, or just leveling buildings with artillery, right? Attrition is going to continue into the future. So those, I think, are some of the main continuities that you're going to see that are going to be the future of war, at least for the next 20 years, period. Like I don't see any way of getting around that. Again, the other part of that too is, okay, let's say we can invest in all these cool little killer robot dogs that can go in and do all the things that infantry might do. And we can remove, let's replay the Battle of Mosul, but let's take Iraqi infantry out of the equation and put killer robot dogs on the ground. At the end of the day, they're still going to have to go in and kill all those Islamic State fighters. they're still going to have to use artillery to support the killer robots getting into position. So attrition is still going to be the predominant form of fighting when you find an actor who says, I can't come out and just fight you because I'm big enough and strong enough, right? And so the other part of that too, there's a natural response, and this is one of the things that I've also hit on, is that positional warfare is part of that, right? So if you don't want to go fight somebody headlong, and there's also misunderstandings, and this is where I think Simpkin in his book is really bad, and it's poisoned the mind of people, is it relates to understanding positional warfare. Positional warfare is not attritional warfare. Positional warfare is not fighting from trenches. Positional warfare is using movement, right, to try and get different things, different geometries, different math ratios of force, different situations to emerge on the battlefield so you can get yourself in a better position. This is the problem with the word positional warfare, is then you have to use the word position when you don't mean it in the context of positional warfare. But to get yourself in a different location that is advantageous for yourself, right? And so as long as attritional warfare exists, as long as urban warfare exists, as long as static warfare exists, positional warfare is going to exist as well. People are going to try and use movement to get you out of a location and into another one so that they can then try and kill you, right? And so that also is a continuity that's going to continue into the future of war. The other part of this that I think is overlooked when we talk about warfare and warfighting and the future of warfare and warfighting is the idea that maneuver is only as useful as it is until it isn't, right? Maneuver only really exists from the point that you start until your forces have closed on each other, that you no longer have the room to continue to do maneuver. Maneuver requires space. And if you're on static lines, right, if you're basically meshed right up against one another, you can't really do maneuver outside of like micro maneuver, right? And so maneuver being dead is going to be something that continues into the future. Now, drones, I think, are just an appendage to combined arms. I don't think drones are a game-changing capability unless you can figure out a way to do aerial resupply of the weapons on a drone. And in most cases, a lot of the drones folks are talking about are small drones, right? So unless you can figure out a way to rig up another grenade on top of drones, like grenade after grenade, drones aren't going to be any kind of game-changing capability for the foreseeable future. Drones provide another contact layer at the aerial, from the air, but that's just another extension of, in my mind, combined arms. But it could also be joint warfighting if you're talking about more strategic level drones. But even then, like, okay, they give you the ability to be seen some more, but then you just stay in the city longer, stay in the areas that it's harder for them to see. So that's another continuity that is another thing about the future of war that I think is overlooked because we've gotten caught up in this hype. The one like data point that everybody points to about the future of drones and how drones are changing warfare is the Nagorno-Karabakh war. And in that situation was very, very unique. It was a very small theater. It was in very, one type of terrain by and large, mountainous terrain, urban terrain, not a lot of room to move. You had, a bad mix of forces on the Armenian side against the perfect solution on the Azerbaijani side as it related to the terrain they happened to be in and the force structure that the Armenians had. And folks walked away from that saying that's the future, and they didn't look at the context of the situation. And so as we think about the future, that's one of the things that I think is important to consider is the context of the situation. And then long-range precision strike, again, it's the same idea. When you get hit from above, you're either going to go underground or you're going to go into something that provides you more protection, in a city, in a building, whatever the case may be. And so unless you're cool flattening cities or flattening buildings, which, again, it goes back to IHL and the law of armed conflict. Theoretically, we're not, but in practice, we've shown we are. But long-range precision strike isn't going to change the game. Here's another funny story for you. So I was working, this is after Mosul. I was reflecting on precision strike in the Battle of Mosul, and I was talking to this British Army lieutenant colonel. And at the time, I was a major. And so we're sitting there talking, and he worked in the J5 with us. And I was like, hey, we're sitting there reflecting on it. And I was like, we would have saved a lot of money and potentially not destroyed as much of the city and killed as many people had we just used like basic artillery to do this job. And we certainly would have saved a ton of money, especially if, like, at the end of the day, the city's flattened anyway. Like, what did it matter that we used precision? And it was like the movie Spinal Tap. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with the movie Spinal Tap and the scene where, there's a scene in there where the producer, it's a spoof making fun of rock bands in the 80s. And anyway, it's in the mockumentary, Rob Reiner's he's producing a documentary on this rock band, right? Spinal Tap. And he's with them backstage, and the guy's showing him his amp, right? And he's like showing him the dials, and he's like, we'd like ours a little louder. Our amps go up to 11. And then Rob Reiner's like, why not make 10 louder? And the guy couldn't fathom the question. And he's like, yeah, but these go up to 11, right? And so the conversation I was having with that guy was very much like that. I was like, what did it matter that we used precision if the city was completely leveled anyway? And I was like, we could have just used ballistic artillery and saved a ton of money. And he's like, yeah, but we used precision. I'm like, but precision didn't matter. The city was still flattened, And it was, in my head, I felt like I was like, am I being filmed? Is there something going on here? Is Rob Reiner going to walk around the corner? And so that's, I think precision's purposely got a narrative built around it that it's inherently better and delivers, more effective and efficient effects, when reality shows that that's not necessarily the case, especially when you consider, again, systems thinking, don't die. And then if you don't die, try and win. And so I just don't see precision strike becoming any sort of game changer. In fact, it may accelerate urban warfare, sieges, and attrition on the battlefields of the future.
Enjoying the episode? Leave a review wherever you listen. YouTube, hit subscribe to keep us going. Let's carry on. So, if I break this down, war doesn't really change at its core. It's still about survival first, and obviously everything else follows from that. And no matter how advanced our systems get, attrition, urban warfare, and positional fighting aren't going anywhere anytime soon.
Yes.
I'm going to tie that into precision strike. On paper, it's supposed to offset the need for large ground forces, but in practice, we've seen cases where it doesn't quite deliver decisive results. So could you walk us through what a precision strike strategy actually looks like in practice? And where do you think it works, and where does it fall short?
Yeah, so precision strike strategy is essentially the idea that you can use precision as a proxy, if you will, for land forces. That's what it's become today. And so the idea is that you can offset the need to put boots on the ground, to use that awful term, but you can offset the requirement to put boots on the ground, and instead, in their place, use precision strike. So you have, again, going back to drones and all this great intelligence information gathering capability we have today. You can find things without having to have people on the ground, and you can kill the enemy without having to have people on the ground. And this is, again, one of those outgrowths of the early 90s. I mean, the idea of precision, I just, for my own podcast, I had James Rogers on, and we recorded yesterday, and he talked about his book Precision and how, it started in the U.S. basically at the end of the First World War, the idea of precision strike. But the strike as a strategy, as we think of it today, really is like the outgrowth of early 90s thinking and that rapid dominance. There was a really horrible book that came out in the early 90s from Defense University Press, and it was called Achieving Rapid Dominance. And again, another book, completely just unfounded assertion about how precision strike and these intelligence gathering capabilities that were emerging at the time would offset the need to put soldiers on the ground and then achieve such, this is where the term shock and awe came from, shock and awe in an adversary that they would just give up. And they'd be like, oh no, your precision strike capability has awed me so much that I'm going to just acquiesce, right? And reality has shown that not to be the case in spades. And so that, and I know I'm being a bit, I'm poking it on purpose because I despise the entire premise. But precision strike itself is very useful and has a place, don't get me wrong, but strike as a strategy, precision strike as a strategy is just a horrible, horrible idea that has no backing in reality. And I say that to say also, there are requirements that land forces must do. If you're fighting a land war, there are certain things land forces have to do, right? And so if we look at the breakup of Yugoslavia and the U.S.'s involvement, we're like, oh, we won the war without, we won it with through air power. Well, there was still armored units, infantry units that had to go in on the ground and occupy territory there. And that's one of the requirements of land forces that often gets overlooked as it relates to all this, right? And a lot of those, not those same forces, but militaries, right? NATO, a bunch of other people are still in that area holding that territory. And that's part of this equation, the strike as strategy part that gets overlooked. But the requirements, right? So one of the things people keep beating the drum about today as it relates to precision strike is, just give Ukraine more ATACMS and more Gimlers and more this and more that. Again, all that's going to do once people start getting, when you start taking indirect fire, what you do is you go for cover and you wait till the indirect fire stops. And some people may get killed in the process because there may not be cover in the area. You may have gotten hit sufficiently with surprise that, you lost a lot of people. And we've seen that happen in Ukraine as it relates to Ukrainians attacking Russians. But at the same time, what they do is they just go underground, right? You go underground, you get in these trenches, or you get in buildings, you hide in the woods to the best the woods can protect you, or whatever the case may be. At the end of the day, like that stuff, those protective measures are often sufficient to keep enough of the force that's getting attacked with precision to retain what it is they're already holding, right? And so what's phase two? More precision strike? Well, again, we've already talked about how that's really expensive and cost prohibitive. You can look this up. It's all open source. But at the Battle of Mosul, there were several times when we ran out of precision strike munitions, and we were waiting on shipments of precision strike munitions to show up. And so what do you do in the interim? Do you not shoot whatever it is you have at the opponent? Do you pause? And these are some of the things that we have to think about when we think about precision strike as a strategy. Unless we find a way, this is, I guess, the point about the future of war too. Unless we find a way to make those significantly cheaper, you're not going to see them used in the way that precision strike advocates, the way that the people that wrote the ideas in Achieving Rapid Dominance or other books and articles and things on the subject talk about. And so that's one of the things that I think is important. Again, going back to the point on land wars too, right? So almost any almost any war is actually a land war, right? Very rarely are airplanes flying in the sky and then the winner of the airplane fight determines the winner of the war, right? Same thing in the water with boats. I'm not a Navy guy, so I don't know the right way to say all this, but if boats are shooting at each other on the water, the one that sinks the most boats isn't like, I'm marrying you one, right? This isn't the...
Don't say too much, Amos. Max wishes he was a Navy guy.
Yeah.
I keep on winding him up about it. It's just like, I love the Navy, got my friends there, but Max, for all his achievements, still dreams about having, sailed the seas and whatever.
That is true indeed, and I'm not ashamed of it.
Yeah, I'll sound really stupid if I talk much further about anything Navy related. So anyway, the land wars, though, right? That's really where those are the decisive types of wars that we talk about as it relates to decisiveness in international affairs. And, like Russia-Ukraine. If Ukraine wants to achieve its stated policy objectives, which I haven't seen it change, I've seen maybe they might change them, but one of the policy objectives is returning the borders to the 1991 boundaries, right? which is what they had basically before 2014 when Russia invaded and took the Donbass and took Crimea. To do that, like, it's going to take a hell of a lot more than precision strike to do that. It's going to take infantry guys and gals on the ground holding territory. To hold territory, you first have to clear that territory of the enemy, right? That's going to cost even more guys and gals on the ground than it is to hold the territory. And so what you have to have is significant land forces to be able to accomplish that clear, right, and destroy the enemy force, take, retake, hold dynamic that is going to be a continuity of war into the future as well. As long as the war is fought for land, you cannot escape that. You may be able to do it in different things, right? Again, if we talk about killer robot dogs, they may be able to go in, probably can't hold the territory. They could probably augment forces holding the territory, but they're not going to be able to necessarily hold it. And so I think that that's one of the counterpoints to this whole idea of precision strike. And, you know, again, as it relates to Russia, Ukraine, all we got to do is give the Ukrainians more ATACMS. No, that's not it at all. They need a significant influx of land forces to retake the territory that's been lost and then hold the territory. Because again, you know, what did the Germans always do in the Second World War and up through, you know, their history before that? What could you always expect after you beat a German, whether it was tactically or operationally? Counterattack, right? They're going to counterattack. And so you have to assume, especially considering the investment at this point, that, you know, Russia in this situation would do something very similar. And they've shown the lack of concern for human life to throw whomever and whatever they have to at that problem. So that's a brief description of my interpretation of precision strike strategy, and then the counterpoint for why it's at least right now insufficient for, you know, any kind of war-winning approach.
I think what you said there, Amos, besides precision strike and just bringing on the case study of Russia, Ukraine, I think that's one of the key points is that Russia's on a war economy footing. Mm-hmm. You're never going to change that. They're going to churn out tanks and ammunitions without the consideration for life.
Yeah.
And Ukraine basically is even though maybe Slavs and very strong military and all that, but it's a case of resources and it's a case of for how long, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If I can jump in really quick on that too. So one of the things that absolutely floors me about this entire conflict and the commenting that goes on about it is, you know, Russia is rolling out T-64s or T-55s, and people are like, oh man, that's bad because the Ukrainians have T-72s and M1s in a very small degree and Leopards and this and that. Like, it doesn't matter that Ukraine has this small qualitative advantage because Russia has a massive quantitative advantage, and they may be inferior tanks. But again, like, if you go back to what doctrine should be, like, tanks shouldn't be fighting other tanks. That's not what tanks are for, right? Tanks weren't originally envisioned to be fighting other tanks. They were meant to get around and, you know, destroy other things, to kill infantry, to get into the rear of formations and wreak havoc. And so, you know, that to me reflects a not understanding how tanks are supposed to be employed, but the fact that it doesn't matter that, you know, like a T-55 versus a Bradley, a T-55 is going to completely destroy a Bradley because a Bradley's got inch-thin aluminum armor. You know what I mean? A T-55 does not, and it has a high-velocity gun or a gun that can penetrate that armor. And so some of this stuff, it absolutely drives me insane when I hear some of these people, a lot of people talk about, you know, oh, Russia's rolling out all this old stuff. They must really be in a dire spot. They may be in a bad spot as it relates to new equipment, but from like a quantitative standpoint, I'm sure they've still got stockpiles upon stockpiles of these old Soviet tanks that they can just pull out, dust off, fuel up, and they're ready to go. And that's the other thing too I think about. I was a tank officer, but I'm not a tank expert, especially old Soviet tank expert. But I would assume too, you know, like the Kalashnikov rifle was built so that anybody could pick it up, anybody could put it in operation, and it would use right away real quick and easy, right? I would assume the tank was built roughly, you know, with the same idea in mind, that you had peasant off the, you know, collective farm that you could quickly throw in this thing and say, ready, set, go, and they could put it into operation really fast. having spent 20 years on our tank, I can assure you that the M1 Abrams is not in that boat. It is very finicky. It is very resource intensive. The amount of fuel that thing burns through, it has to be refueled every 8 hours. It's tricky to learn outside of like the common like joystick part of it. All the other things, the buttons you got to push when you get in there, all that stuff. It's a fairly complicated thing, and so that's another virtue I think of. And again, I'm not glorifying Russia or Russian equipment. I'm just stating things from a realistic point of view. Like, that's a fairly simple, easy set of equipment that they have that they can quickly dust off and put into the fight. Whereas a lot of the stuff that Ukraine's getting from the West is challenging to learn, expensive, and, it's got to be fueled quite regularly. I don't know the burn rates on a T-55 or a T-64 or whatever, but I would assume they're burning diesel and it doesn't burn nearly as quickly as a jet turbine engine in the back of an Abrams,
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about the Soviet engineering. It went through, right? Like it could be an Mi-8 versus the play on the moving parts on the Kalashnikov would allow for this and for heat and throw it in the mud, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think Max might know more about the tanks. I certainly am not an armor expert, but I do realize what happened, or a little bit, of course, in the Second World War on the Eastern Front, and that was waves and waves and waves of tanks based off the economy, based off the culture, and basically what you said, don't die, you gave us a good go, and now we're going to show you what we have, and then you can go into the detail of deep battle, or the theoretical elements of it, and what that means for holding land, disrupting your enemy, compared to the Western or Normandy, etc. I think Russia defeated 3/4 of the Wehrmacht compared to, but I mean, someone will email later to tell me why I'm wrong again. But conceptually, more or less,
it's also fascinating too. You talk about the costs. The Soviet Union threw in, they lost upwards of 20 million people in the conflict collectively. That's not just their military, but collectively 20 million people fighting the Germans, and then the U.S., the Brits, the Canadians, and other partners, right? The French, and then other folks that were helping out there lost not even anywhere close to that number. And that's not to take anything away from that side of the conflict, but I think the other part, and this may be why you see part of this in the U.S. military in particular, part of this fascination is probably not the right word, idolization of the Wehrmacht, was the fact that they stacked up as many casualties on 2 fronts, 3 fronts, depending if you're looking at Italy at the same time too, right? And if you count North Africa, also as part of that. The fact that they were able to just generate the massive amount of casualties with such a small, because the German army was, smaller, it wasn't small at that time, but smaller military force fighting at least a 2-front war, and that's part of my beef is also this fascination and love affair that the West, the U.S. in particular, tends to have with the German army coming out of the Second World War. But at the same time, it does need to get like that. Yes, it was an effective killing machine. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, just your comment on the Russians, the Soviet Union, there, like I was having this conversation, in fact, with my wife like 2 nights ago, because she has to listen to all this stuff not in podcast form, but just me riffing and stream of consciousness, and it just I was like astounded as I was reflecting on that, just how brutally effective they were at generating on the battlefield, not even talking about what they did in society on the battlefield, combat losses.
It's unreal, I think, and the organizational, I mean, I know now we're probably going tangent kind of stuff over here.
No, it's all good.
But yeah, the organizational ability, right, it's like, it was just, with the tragedy of it all, it was just next level.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing too. You talk about systems thinking again. It's sometimes you may not be given the order "don't die." Sometimes you may be given the order "die," but human instinct kicks in, and "don't die" is how you inflict those casualties. Right? When you think about what was going on the Eastern Front, the Russians had surrounded, or the Soviets had surrounded the Germans in Stalingrad, right? And that thing went as long as it did because systems thinking, don't die. And if you don't die, try and win. Well, the Germans held out for so long trying not to die, as opposed to just throwing their arms up and saying, screw it, we're out. And just think about, had they, whenever they reached that point that that battle was actually done, and I don't know what it is, I'm not a Stalingrad historian, but there was a point at which I'm sure like historians are like, yeah, the battle was really over, but the Germans held out for X amount of time longer, right? Like, what is that number of Soviet soldiers they killed in the process, And that's why I think it's important to understand and appreciate systems thinking more so than necessarily rational thinking. And I think rationality is a huge part of everything, but I think systems thinking is far more ingrained in the DNA of humans than rationality is, like systems thinking is survivalist thinking. Rationality is how can I economize my decision making in this moment?
Yeah.
And those are distinct and I think important differences that need to be clearly understood when we think about military thought.
Absolutely. And I want to come back to what you had said earlier about the idea of quality, and it ties in very well with eland or maneuver, however we frame it. Quality, small forces, we can do the damage, get the win. And it's I think it was Khrushchev that said, but the famous, but quantity is also a quality.
Yeah.
And that really it just, summarizes Soviet thought that we're going to go at it and go at it and go at it, and that's it. And I think we, in a bit of self-deception, and don't get me wrong, I'm fully for and support the Ukrainian effort. They fought bravely, they're fighting bravely.
Yeah.
Acts of bravery from Zelensky down, from 2022. In fact, maybe the modern act of political bravery when he showed up in the streets of Kiev and the video camera and yeah, I am.
Oh, absolutely.
So, and then, it galvanized, but the reality though, that's all great, but the reality, it's going to be a game of economics and, logistics. Max touched it, you touched it. And I'm kind of thinking like at some point, where's this going to go?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, there wasn't a question in there. It was just me just on the end of a long tangent.
Yeah, no, I just if I can comment really quick on that, and then I'll let you answer your question. Yeah, I think that's the other aspect of this that when we think about the Russia-Ukraine war is how many times and how long has it been that you've heard in this conflict that Russia's economy is on the verge of collapse, right?
Yeah.
They were saying, whoever they were saying this 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months into the conflict, right? And then they, at the same time, also poo-poo Russia's economy, right? And it may be like I live in Texas, it may be the size of Texas's economy, one of our 50 states, but it's resilient. And that's something that we overlook when we look at dollar amount and productivity and GDP is how resilient is it? Can it take a punch and keep going? And how resilient or fragile are our economies? Would our economy be able to take a punch and continue forward if it was in our national interest to continue forward? And so again, like you said, I don't say that to glorify Russia because I'm fully behind Ukraine in the conflict as well. And I'm fully behind the U.S.'s contributions to Ukraine in the conflict as well. But that's something coming out of this war, and probably right now, if we haven't already, the West collectively needs to start looking at their own economies and thinking, do we have the resilience built into our economies that if we were to find ourselves in an existential fight like Ukraine against somebody that has, the insulated economy like Russia does, the lack of care of human life like Russia does, the depth of, strategic depth of, military warfighting equipment like Russia does, would we be able to hold out like Ukraine has, And I think a lot of us wouldn't be able to answer yes to that question. And if that's the answer, and we think that, the future of armed conflict is some sort of China scenario or really is a Russia scenario, then there's some like strategic economic considerations that a lot of states need to start making.
Max, I don't mean to hog it. I'm going to say one more thing on this about because it comes down to what you're prepared to live with, and what you're willing to tolerate.
Yeah.
And we were a friend of ours who we work with. He's a deputy minister in Ukraine, so part of the war cabinet. And once we were on a call, and he says, Tony, the thing is, the Russians are willing to fight and survive with nothing. They're willing to,
Yeah.
And I asked him, I said, Kostian, what about you and you guys, Ukrainians? He said, yeah, us too. And so this is a dogfight, right? The two of them, and you just think, okay, I get it, but I'm now in a full circle.
And that's why I think the economic side is really what's going to determine the outcome. It's not the will, right? They're both determined. They both different sets of determined, right? Russia doesn't care about throwing human life at the problem. Ukraine does care about throwing life at the problem, but they have the domestic will, political will to stay in the fight, and they have the will to survive as a state, right? They have the sovereignty at the fore of their minds and not denationalization like Russia, Putin has openly stated. And so like that in itself, I think it's a fight of economics more so than a lot of other wars. This one will be won or lost based off economics.
Support the mission, one beer at a time. Head to undergroundstrategy.com/support and we'll raise a glass in your honor. Now, let's get back to it. Yeah, and I mean, you can really see that in Sweden. I mean, we haven't been at war since, over 200 years, at least on paper. So we lack that experience. I mean, not in terms of special forces contributions and stuff like that, but in running a wartime economy at scale. And in the early 2022, I mean, the government, they stirred up this kind of urgency, saying that we had 10 days to prepare because Russia might, invade from Kaliningrad otherwise. And of course, that got people moving, but they failed to grasp the long game here. I mean, war economy is not about quick reactions. It's all about sustained effort.
Yeah.
So instead of managing expectations, they went all in on this short-term panic. And now, 2 years later, reality is setting in. Hard choices need to be made, and budgets are shifting. Things people take for granted, like healthcare, education, are getting cut. And that should have been a part of the public conversation from the start, I think. If Sweden is going to sustain its support for Ukraine, it needs resilience. I mean, not just military resilience, but politically and financially. And hopefully we can adjust and learn from this.
See, and as an American, that's one of the, it's almost a joke. That's why the joke is that's why we don't have free healthcare, or free education.
Oh man, it's and you know what? A lot of the world, I'm probably going to get criticized for it, but benefits from this big defense spending because it helps providing that umbrella for much of the freedoms that much of the Western and associated Western world enjoys.
Yeah.
We'll get someone to help us with the hate mail.
Yeah.
Max. But I'm sticking with it. It's true.
Well, we'll see how that changes in the next. I don't know when this is going to air, but we'll see how that changes in the next week after the inauguration of Trump. But I'm not going to get political. We were talking politics before the show started recording, but I'll leave that there.
That's a different discussion.
Yeah.
Max, I think we almost at the end of our questions. I was just thinking, perhaps, I'm not sure if you want to mention, Amos, just a little bit about your books, the ones that you have out, some of your research. We of course, going to add links into the show notes and on our website, and then maybe your future projects too, just so, get it out there.
Yeah, thanks. So we're, like I said earlier, working on a book with for Bloomsbury. It's called Maneuvers Dead: Understanding Land Warfare in the 21st Century. That's due to the publisher, so I'm actively working on that, writing that. That's due to the publisher in March, the end of March, and so 2025. So however long it takes for that to get through the system with Bloomsbury, that'll be out hopefully before the end of the year. This is my first book with Bloomsbury, so I don't know. They're terrific, by the way, and I love them, and they're great. And really appreciative of them bringing me on. And then I'm doing another book this is a co-edited book on multi-domain operations with Franz Stefangati as the co-editor, and Franz is, a big defense military analyst. He's doing all sorts of stuff, published all over the place, foreign affairs, survival, you name it. He's all over it. Big European analyst, so a lot of folks probably know who he is. So he's a co-editor on that. We've got folks that worked on MDO when it was a concept, and then when it transitioned into doctrine that helped with that. So they're writing the front end of the book. So there's that section of the book. And there's a middle section, which is critiques of MDO from U.S. specific authors. Some of them are in the Army or in the military. Some of them work at professional military education outlets, so like the Air War College or whatever the hell they call it, the Air General Staff College. It's got a different name than what the Army calls it. And then, some other folks with that one. And then there's a big section with international authors. And so this is really where Franz was able to really help too, because of his connections. And then also the fact that if you couldn't tell by the name, he's not American. I think I also mentioned it earlier that he's Austrian. So he's got great contacts, and he was able to pull in some really, really good people that are contributing to the book on that end. So we have people from Austria, the Netherlands, Brazil, Japan, and a couple of other countries. I apologize to the authors for forgetting. Australia was one of them, and then a couple of other places. So it's not just like a U.S. biased book. It's not just UK. We got a current UK 2-star also contributing. And then, so it's not just a Western. There's a host of perspectives that are coming into this. I'm looking at MDO and offering thoughts and feedback, criticisms, accolades, it's all over the place. So that's the other book. That one's also too on the same day through the publisher. So I've got 2 books due at the same day, on the same day that I'm currently trying to get done. And so that one's that.
Jesus, that is a hectic schedule, man.
Yeah, it's pretty rough. And so there's that. And then because of that, I'm not doing a lot of additional research outside of focusing on Maneuver's Dead book. It has a chapter on maneuver, obviously a chapter on positional warfare. I provide an actual theory of positional warfare and build out what it really is, right? This is what it looks like. These are the ideas behind it. This is how it's applicable. Here's examples from time and different things on what it is. And then I do the same thing with attrition. And then there's a chapter in there on attrition, talks about that. There's the one that the chapter I'm currently working on, I was working on before we got on the call, is on reframing the levels of war, partially because of some of what we've talked about as it relates to economics and whatnot, like strategy. The strategic level is insufficient for what policymakers are really doing. And, the strategic level is more really just what the military is doing. And so that's part of, and that's a very, very simplistic version of what I was working on today. But there's that chapter, and then there's a chapter on systems thinking, similar to what I talked about in the cup, but expanding on it and making it a bit more plain there to see. So that's the basis of that book. And, that one I'm super stoked about, and I hope that it resonates in a way that I hope it resonates. I want it to be a book that, as a theory nerd, oh my God, I just read this book and it blew my mind. I don't necessarily want to blow anybody's mind, but I want it to be something where they're this is a book that I'm going to reread once a year until I no longer believe in it, which is what I did with the Fighting by Minutes book. I used to reread it once a year until I came to the realization that I no longer aligned with the way that Robert Leonard thought. And then I was now I'll just read it once every 2 years, because it's still a phenomenal things that I'm working on, a couple papers, Russia-Ukraine war paper, and then that'll be out in Small Wars Journal here. And I'm trying to tie it with the beginning or the anniversary of the conflict, so it'll be out in late February. And then there was one other one. What's the other one? Oh, drone warfare paper that I'm working on as well. So that covers a lot of ground that we covered here today, saying how it's combined arms. It's not this game changer. It's not a game changer for all these reasons. So those are the big things. Appreciate you guys letting me throw that out there. And thanks for the invite.
It was great having you. I feel before we close, I need to confess one thing.
You hated my book? That's fine.
No,
It's all good.
no, God. Rather the other way. My master's thesis, when I was in the military, I used the historical campaign and compared it with maneuver theory. So, I'm not going to bore listeners because no one gives. So I completely understand, what you were saying about so many assertions in my defense. And of course, this is I'm sure no one's surprised that there would be a little bit of a defense of myself, was that, I tried to look at it more as a case of this happened. Can you apply it? Here's the evidence. Here's what aligns, I'm sure someone could do a thesis with exactly the same for attrition or for positional warfare or for some sort of whatever concept they chose. But that was my last confessions, was while you were speaking, I was like, through my mind, I was like, oh my God, am I,
Am I a heretic? Oh God. Am I a charlatan? Hey, here's the other thing too. Every time I write something and I'm like, all right, I'm going to hit send to wherever it's got to go to get published, I immediately worry about that. I'm not putting words in your mouth. I worry about being perceived as a charlatan or somebody that's like insufficiently provided evidence to support their argument,
Oh man.
And I worry about the criticism too. I don't care about it. I'll say that. Like, I hope I did the work on the front end, but on the back end, I don't really care what people have to say. But I also never reread anything I write for that reason too, because I don't want to read it and be like, God damn, this guy's stupid. Oh, that guy's me. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, you couldn't make me read anything not for love or money, right? Like, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think where I kind of treaded a little bit away from the main theory argument was saying, here's a theory as it is. Does it align as it is? Not, what's the basis of the theory? What are principles? What are concepts? Now that I've managed to get the last few guys that were awake to sleep with my blabbing. I mean, yeah, so that was, and now I just focus more on the historical stuff, Amos. And then of course, Max has just recently released his memoir, shameless self-promotion by us, and it's been released in Swedish. So it's been translated. I'm sure his experiences could tie in a lot with what you'd mentioned about Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on. But really cool. Thank you so much for joining us. It was really a tour de force. I've been an expert. You've just made such a compelling case for the importance of military theorists for all the various concepts you discussed today. I'm not going to name them, but sieges, urban warfare, all the way through the continuities of war. It's a masterclass. And then just a big thank you. We'll post the links to your books and anything else, and those authors that you've mentioned in the edited collection, and whatever else will be beneficial. And then last words to you, Max.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Amos. I got no confessions to make because this has been my first and only doctrine refresher since Defense College. So I'm definitely in the clear. But honestly, this has been a great conversation, a real masterclass, and I hope we will have you back on the pod again. And who knows, maybe one day we can sit down over a beer and talk doctrine properly. And listen, if you made it this far and you're completely lost between doctrine, precision strike strategies, and positional warfare, I'll offer you some actual practical advice. Always carry a tourniquet, never trust a map made by someone who's never set foot on the ground, and if you think it's an ambush, it's already too late. Thank you again, Amos, and to all our listeners, we'll see you next week. Take care.
Thanks, gentlemen.